Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And you reminded me of that Woman of Steel award. And at the time when I had received it, my children were much younger and they were so fascinated that I could be like a woman of steel. They thought it was some kind of superhero or something. So it was really a kind of cute, along with a very reputable and responsible honor. So thank you. It really is a true pleasure to be here today. And what I plan to do is hit the highlights of the state of the automotive industry. We're going to cover industry economics, automotive outlook, the EV transition, affordability, and competitiveness with China. So let's get started with industry economics. In each section that I cover, I'm going to give you the key takeaways. Then I'll show you the data that supports the comment. Despite inflation and shifting trade policy, car buying signals remain stable as consumer sentiment weakens and imports decline. GDP saw some volatility in 2025. In a nutshell, in Q1, GDP plummeted because imports rose to get ahead of tariffs. In Q2 and Q3, imports declined and consumers rushed to buy vehicles ahead of anticipated rising prices from tariffs. And then in Q4, in addition to the government shutdown, there was an end-of-year inventory adjustment and production pullback. So what does all this mean? 2025 US GDP growth averaged a solid 2.2%. In 2026, GDP is expected to remain stable with moderate continued growth. Within the automotive industry, GDP growth above 2% has historically supported steady to increasing vehicle sales. However, two important caveats should be considered. One, AI-driven data center investments are disproportionately supporting GDP growth, potentially making headline economic performance appear stronger than underlying household consumption. And two, K-shaped economic conditions are contributing to stronger sales of higher-priced vehicles, while affordability pressures constrain broader industry volume. Despite a relatively stable GDP, consumer confidence and sentiment is on a steady decline, notably lower than pandemic levels. So let's compare the Consumer Price Index with the Producer Price Index of parts and vehicles. This is arguably the most telling slide in the deck. Prior to 2022 chip shortage, consumer pricing and vehicle and parts pricing generally moved in alignment. During the semiconductor crisis, strong consumer demand and constrained supply caused consumer vehicle prices to rise significantly above parts and producer costs. And that gap has largely persisted today. Automakers maintained elevated pricing for several reasons: margin preservation, recovering higher input and supply chain costs, and supporting the significant capital investment required for the EV transition. This is also one reason automakers have had greater ability to absorb portions of the 2025 tariff-related cost increases without immediately passing the full impact on to consumers. I mentioned tariffs caused vehicle imports to decline. Prior to April of last year, effective vehicle tariffs averaged about 1.5% on imports, supporting vehicle import value of $250 billion. Following the tariff increase, effective tariffs rose to an average of 18.6%, contributing to a decline in vehicle import value of more than $50 billion. That is a significant amount of capital, and it is one of the key drivers behind the increase in U.S. investment activity and reshoring efforts we are seeing across the industry. In fact, U.S. produced vehicle sales increased 5.8%, primarily at the expense of Canada and Mexico. Hence, production is being reallocated within North America, and that matters because our supply chains are deeply integrated. As USMCA comes up for renegotiation, preserving that framework will be critical. So, next section, automotive outlook. 2026 Q1 U.S. sales normalize following tariff-driven pull-ahead demand last year, while some brands gain market share despite inflationary pressures. U.S. auto sales declined for the 7th consecutive month in April, down 7% year over year. The decline is primarily driven by the pull-ahead demand we saw in Q2 and Q3 of last year. The next few months will be critical in assessing whether SAAR can stabilize at levels comparable to last year. In 2025, overall U.S. sales were up 2.4%. Light trucks increased 4.7%, now representing 83% of total market share, while passenger car sales continued to structurally decline. 2026 year-to-date, U.S. sales are down 6.7%, while both light truck and passenger car segment sales are down. Light truck continues, however, to gain market share, growing 0.5%. I included the 2026 year-to-date brand performance for context, as many of you work with different OEMs. Here you can see that most brands are down year-to-date, with the exception of Hyundai, Kia, and Stellantis. Hyundai Kia sales performance is being supported by an aggressive hybrid strategy, while Stellantis is showing early signs of portfolio recovery. And the rest of the brands, Lucid results are highly skewed due to its low overall volume base. In terms of market share, brands with strong hybrid portfolios continue to gain momentum, particularly Toyota, Hyundai Kia, and Honda. In addition, again, those early signs suggest that the portfolio strategies implemented by Stellantis and Nissan are beginning to support a recovery in market performance. And finally, this brings us to the 2026 U.S. sales forecast. At this point, industry forecasts are largely converging around a SAAR of approximately 60 million units, roughly 300,000 fewer vehicle sales than last year. Moving on to the EV transition. Full battery electric and plug-in hybrid momentum slows as hybrid demand surges. Are policy shifts following consumers or shaping them? Well, let's look at how EV policy has shifted over the past 18 months. I would characterize this as a near complete reversal in direction. Policy changes have ranged from prioritizing expanded American energy production to halting portions of EV infrastructure funding and eliminating EV tax incentives, to challenging state zero emission mandates, reducing penalties associated with failing to meet CAFE requirements, and ultimately reconsidering the EPA endangerment finding framework. Policy shifts of this magnitude create greater flexibility for OEMs to reevaluate their product portfolios and better align future investments with actual consumer demand. However, these shifts also create risk as the US diverges from broader global automotive trends. Today, electrified vehicles in the US account for 20% market share. And by electrified, I mean hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and full battery electric vehicles. Internal combustion engine, or ICE, holds the remaining 80% of the market. What's interesting is that the only propulsion that is gaining year-to-date sales momentum is the hybrid. All other propulsion types are down in sales compared to last year. Consumers are looking for better fuel economy without having to commit to charging. Hybrids now represent 14.5% of US market share, while the full battery electric vehicles have declined to 5.1 after peaking at 7.8 in 2024. There's a reason I extended this data back to 1999, and that is when the first hybrid vehicle, the Toyota Prius, was introduced to the US market. Think about the pace of adoption. It took nearly 27 years for hybrids to reach 14.5% market share, despite requiring virtually no change in consumer behavior compared to traditional ICE vehicles. And finally, I overlaid gasoline prices in real terms. And at this point, there is no significant correlation between fuel prices and propulsion mix trends. However, this remains an area we will continue to monitor closely. So in summary, we close this section with the BEV forecast outlook. Year over year, industry experts have continued to lower their EV adoption forecasts. And frankly, I believe even the current projection of 16% market share by 2030 may still be overstated. Moving on to capital investments. Investments shift toward the US, southern states, and internal combustion engine technologies. At the Center for Automotive Research, we analyze capital investment announcements to understand where the trends are going in North America. Since 2020, over $234 billion of investments have been announced by automakers. 77% in the United States, 13% in Canada, and only 9% in Mexico. Shown here is a breakdown of where the 77% of announced investments, or $181 billion, are planned. Georgia has now overtaken Michigan in share of total announced investments. Overall, we continue to see strong concentration of investment along the southern manufacturing corridor, driven by lower costs and expanding supplier ecosystems tied to electrification, battery production, and localization. This geographic shift highlights how the industry's manufacturing footprint continues to evolve with technological changes. Here we see the impact of trade policy on investment announcements. Note how all investments in 2025 and thus far in 2026 are in the US. Here we see the impact of regulations on investment announcements. Note the shift back towards internal combustion engine investments in 2025 and 2026. That wraps up the automotive update, and I'd like to spend my last 10 minutes on two subjects that are on everyone's mind, beginning with vehicle affordability. New vehicle transaction prices increased $15,000 over the past 10 years, but affordability is more nuanced with inflation, consumer preference, and technology shifts. Over the past 10 years, average new vehicle transaction prices have increased by approximately $15,000. However, when adjusted for inflation expressed in real terms, the increase is significantly more modest at roughly $4,000. This highlights that while nominal prices have risen sharply, a large portion of that increase reflects broader inflation, shifting consumer preferences, and increased technology and feature mix, rather than pure pricing power alone. Here you can see that today's vehicles are on average larger and heavier. This aligns with the continued shift in the US market toward light trucks, which now represent about 83% of sales, compared to just 17% for passenger cars, as mentioned earlier. To put that in perspective, in 2015, passenger cars still accounted for roughly 35% of market share, twice today's share. Taken together, these trends suggest that rising vehicle transaction prices reflect both inflationary pressure and continued shift in vehicle mix towards larger, higher content segments. So who is buying these larger, more expensive vehicles? The answer? Households in the top 20% income bracket now account for 55% of new vehicle spending, up from 40% just 5 years ago. This is a clear example of the K-shaped economy I mentioned earlier. And this sets the stage for my final topic, global competitiveness and China. China's growing overcapacity is forcing global expansion as North American consumers show increasing acceptance of China-built vehicles. Let's start by looking inside China. China production has now exceeded China demand. More importantly, China is estimated to have approximately 15.4 million units of excess production capacity. 15.4 million vehicles is equivalent to nearly the entire annual US vehicle market. As a result, to avoid underutilization, sustained operating losses, and potential plant closures, China is increasingly relying on global exports to absorb this surplus capacity. So now let's look globally. Chinese brand sales are up 101% since 2020. They've doubled in 5 years. The rest of the world brands combined sales are up 7%. Let's look at Mexico. In 2025, 1 out of every 4 vehicles sold in Mexico was produced in China. And more than 50% of those China-produced vehicles sold were Chinese brands. Let's look at Canada. We've all heard about the 49,000 China-built electric vehicles that can enter Canada at a 6% tariff rate. The question is, will Canadian consumers buy them? Well, in 2024, approximately 30,000 Tesla vehicles built in Shanghai were sold in Canada. However, this trend did not continue into 2025 because Canada aligned its tariff policy with the US by raising tariffs to 100% and removing EV tax incentives, effectively curbing further growth in these imports. In closing, the pace of China's growth in North America will ultimately be shaped by policy direction and the evolving structure of the North American supply base. Thank you.